Welcome to Kingdom Conversations. I'm your host, Sharia Devon, and this is a safe space for believers to feel encouraged, understood, and honest about the tension between our humanity and living a Christ-centered life. Here, we walk this journey together, talking about relationships, boundaries, family, healing, and all the moments where faith meets real life. If you're looking for encouragement and a space that meets you right where you are, welcome in. This is Kingdom Conversations. This episode starts after the prayer gets answered. David is on the throne. The wars are being won. The promise God made is fulfilled. He's king. And that's where I want to pause. Because we talk a lot about trusting God while we're waiting. But we don't talk enough about what it looks like to steward the promise once we're living inside of the promise. Purpose doesn't end when we arrive. In many ways, that's when responsibility actually begins. David's story forces us to ask a harder question. Not just can God get you there, but can you steward what he gives you when you do? And can you steward it well? Because if you can, your legacy will last a lifetime. With that being said, let's get into it. Hey y'all, welcome to part 3 of Purpose. If you've been with me thus far, we have come a long way. I'm going to remind you, like I do every episode, you can't start at part 3. You gotta go back to part 1 so that you get all the details, all the tea about our friend David. But if you are up to speed, let's jump right in. So we left off with David being crowned King of Judah. Now, you might be wondering, wait a minute, I thought David was King of Israel. Why are you saying he's King of Judah? You're right. I did my homework. Let's do some geography. So during this time, Israel was kind of split into 2 separate parts. We don't have time today, but if we go into the history of the people of Israel and how I told you they were broken up into 12 tribes, because we learned that Saul was a part of the 12th tribe, which was the smallest tribe, and it was the tribe of Benjamin. So during this time, when God gave Israel different parts of the land, he separated them kind of by tribe. And Judah, by far, was one of the most biggest tribes, so they kind of were like their own entity. And the rest of the other tribes kind of resided in Israel. So when David became king, he became king over Judah, essentially, and then after a while, he was crowned king of Israel. Because if you read in 2 Samuel, just because David was anointed king, it's not going to be easy for our friend. He was king of Judah, but then one of Saul's sons decided that he was the rightful heir and he was in charge of Israel for a while. But then he got killed. It was a whole bunch of drama, and then David was crowned king. So we fast forwarded. We're here. David is now king of Israel and Judah. But for the purpose of this podcast, we're just going to say Israel, because as time goes on, they're not separated by tribes anymore. Israel is just Israel. So here we are. Friends, we made it. There's no cliffhangers here. I'm not going to trick you and tell you about all the bad things that are getting ready to happen. Now, there are some things that are going to happen, but we'll get into it. But right now, let's just bask in the ambience. David has been through it. He is here. He has finally walking, sitting, being in what God has anointed him to be. Do you know that David is now 30 years old? 30. He was anointed to be king at around 15 or 16. Slays Goliath at around 17. Is on the run. He was on the run for like 15 years. He is 30. I'm pretty sure that there is some significance of turning 30, but you should probably do some research. There is probably some significance around the age 30. But I digress. We have arrived, friends. David is here. And guess what? he is living his best life because that's what happens when you are fulfilling the promise. Or like what we talked about before, he's at a point. He's reached a midpoint, right? His life isn't over now. This isn't the end. But David is king. He has plenty of wives. He is, in this nice cedar palace. He has maids, all the things. And he is successful. David is successful. And you know what David decides? He decides we need to go get God. You might be thinking, what? What do you mean we need to go get God? David says we need to go get God. We need to go get our Ark of the Covenant. So, if you're not a Bible historian, I'm not, but I do like history. I want to give you just a brief historical context of the Ark of the Covenant. So when David said that he wanted to go get God, basically, before David got on the throne, even before Saul was on the throne, and I told you that Israel did not have any real leadership as far as a king, that they had an Ark of the Covenant. So stay with me. I'm going to give you the quick and dirty deep dive, okay? There might be some people that you don't know about. That's fine. If you continue to listen to this podcast, as we continue to get into community with each other, I'm pretty sure that we will learn about a lot of different Bible folks. But for this time, just stick with me, okay? I just need to give you the context. So boom. The Ark of the Covenant was not just like symbolic. It was a physical object. And it basically represented God's covenant, like his presence and authority for the children of Israel. So way back in Exodus. So if you saw The Prince of Egypt, which by far is one of the best movies DreamWorks has ever made, then you are familiar with the story of Moses and the people of Israel. And Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, let my people go. And Pharaoh is like, no, I'm not letting them go. But then eventually he lets them go because all these plagues happen and Moses parts the Red Sea, right? You know that story. You know the Prince of Egypt. Okay. So back in Exodus, if you go read Exodus, all of that is literally about Moses. Exodus literally means exit. And so basically in the book of Exodus, God specifically told the children of Israel how to create this sacred chest. And this sacred chest had to be made out of wood, and it was painted gold, super fancy. And what was inside was the 10 Commandments, our friend Moses, a jar of manna, which was this unleavened bread that God had gave the children of Israel. It was a miracle that he had did. And Aaron's staff. So Moses had a brother named Aaron. He also was a great leader, standing next to Moses, making sure that the children of Israel got delivered and got to where they needed to go. So in this ark are those things. So the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, a jar of manna, and Aaron's staff. And so this ark was really, really important. And it was also a symbol because God was with the children of Israel wherever they went. But the plot twist is that there never was a specific space for it to go. And then the children of Israel got in a lot of wars and they made a lot of mistakes and decided they were going to be foolish. And sometimes they were taken captive and put into exile. And so the Ark of the Covenant was also kind of taken. And it would be with people who weren't necessarily monotheistic, or it would be captured by their enemies, people who might not have served God. And so it was never in its rightful place. And so the very first thing that David decides to do is that he decides that he needs to go get the Ark of the Covenant, and he is going to create a temple for it to dwell. And so that was one of his very first initiatives. And I think that also, once again, speaks to David's character. The very first thing that David wants to do is put God first. He wants to make sure that God is in his rightful place. The physical Ark of the Covenant, but also the representation, the symbolic part of God, which speaks to his heart and speaks to his character, that he's putting his belief on display. This is what we stand for, ladies and gentlemen. The land of Israel, whoever I rule and reside over, We need to make sure that we all understand why we're here, why I'm here. It's because of our God. So boom, David goes to get the Ark of the Covenant, but it kind of goes wrong. They can't transport it the way they need to transport it because the Ark of the Covenant is considered holy and they don't carry it the right way. And one of the handlers, they die. I know, trigger warning. But the power was so heavy on that thing that he literally died from not carrying it correctly. So David is like, hold up. You know what? Let's just leave this here. And I'm going to build a tent. It's not a temple yet, but I'm going to make a fancy tent so that we can bring the Ark of the Covenant and put it in its rightful place. So David gets the Ark of the Covenant and he begins to work on God's temple. David is building this fancy schmancy tent that the Ark of the Covenant, God is going to reside until he can build the temple. And so because David is now king of Judah and Israel, he sets up his palace in Jerusalem, in the city of David. And Jerusalem becomes a major city. Jerusalem is a major point, not just in the Bible, but also in geography and in history. So we know from the other parts around Saul and around David that God had given the people of Israel prophets to speak to them because God wasn't really speaking to people directly, so he had prophets to speak for him. And we know that Saul and David had Samuel, but lots of years have passed and Samuel has also passed. And so there's another prophet that comes onto the scene that is an integral part to David's legacy, and his name is Nathan. And so David is at the height of his reign. He is flourishing on all cylinders. He is in Jerusalem, in the city of David. He is building God's temple. He is successful on every front as far as the military and wars and protecting borders. It's his season of harvest, you know? He has sown a lot of seeds and he is reaping the promise that God has given him. And so Nathan comes to him with a message to let him know that God is extremely pleased with him. And because God is pleased with him, that God has promised to bless his lineage, that his name is going to be a name that rules and reigns and is talked about for years to come. So we pick up in 2 Samuel. I'm around the 7th chapter. And in the 7th chapter, Nathan comes to David with a word from the Lord. Now, I'm actually going to read this to you because me summarizing it would not suffice. When King David was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all the surrounding enemies, the king summoned Nathan the prophet. "Look," David said, "I am living in a beautiful cedar palace, but the ark of God is out there in a tent." Nathan replied to the king, "Go ahead and do whatever you have in mind, for the Lord is with you." But that same night, the Lord said to Nathan, "Go and tell my servant David that this is what the Lord has declared. Are you the one to build a house for me to live in? I have never lived in a house from the day I brought the Israelites out of Egypt until this very day. I have always moved from one place to another with a tent and a tabernacle as my dwelling. Yet, no matter where I have gone with the Israelites, I have never once complained to Israel's tribal leaders, the shepherds of my people. I have never asked them, 'Why haven't you built me a beautiful cedar house?' Now go and say to my servant David, 'This is what the Lord of heaven's armies has declared. I took you from tending sheep in the pasture and selected you to be the leader of my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have destroyed all your enemies before your eyes. Now I will make your name as famous as anyone has ever lived on the earth. And I will provide a homeland for my people Israel, planting them in a secure place where they will never be disturbed. Evil nations won't oppress them as they've done in the past, starting from the time I appointed judges to rule my people Israel. And I will give you rest for all your enemies. Furthermore, the Lord declares that he will make a house for you, a dynasty of kings. For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build a house, a temple for my name, and I will secure his royal throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. If he sins, I will correct and discipline him with the rod like any father would do. But my favor will not be taken from him as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from your sight. Your house and your kingdom will continue before me for all time, and your throne will be secure forever. Let's just sit with that, y'all. Isn't that powerful? I'm thinking about David, and I'm thinking he went through so much. But he was so obedient, not perfect, but he was obedient and listened. And even when people around him were trying to rush the process, especially when he had Saul in his sight multiple times, he didn't give in to the peer pressure around him. He believed what God said and he trusted his timing. And while that is difficult, as we all know, because patience is hard, that was a part of purpose. God had this promise for him that he was going to bless his lineage. His legacy is going to live on and God is going to be with him. What if David wouldn't have listened? What if he would have moved too early? What if he would have been cocky? That doesn't mean that he might not have gotten the throne, but maybe he wouldn't have gotten the promise associated with his purpose. That's what I'm sitting with. Nathan reports back to David and shares with him what the Lord has said, and David is grateful. And the scripture says that he immediately goes and he prays and he thanks the Lord and is so humble in his prayer. He literally says to God, what is it about me? Like, what is it that you see in me? Like, why would you promise me such a thing? Not in a doubtful way, but in a humble way. Like, who am I for you to honor me and to have purpose and promise for generations to come? Purpose is so aligned with obedience. At least that's what I'm thinking. In order to fulfill the promise and to walk in purpose, you have to be obedient. And that's why I'm so grateful that God looks at our hearts, because his heart was obedient and his actions followed. And when I say obedience, I don't mean I'm not talking about legalism. I'm not talking about following God in a legalistic way, like here are all these rules. That's not what I mean by obedience. When I'm thinking about obedience and I'm talking to myself, I'm thinking more about trust. Can you trust God? Can I trust God? Can I believe that what he has anointed me to do, that he will fulfill? Can I stay the course and believe that no matter what it looks like, I'm going to trust that he's going to do it? It is absolutely easier said than done. I can attest to that. David can attest to that. But obedience more like trust. And not a blind trust either. Still putting in the work, like you're not just sitting and being like, yep, trust you. Let me know when you show up, God. But we talked about before in parts 2, stewarding well the season that you're in, trusting God and having him lead you in the season that you're in as you're on this journey and this road to purpose, to the promise. And so right now, David is at a midpoint. He's living his best life at this moment. He is in his throne season. And so as we continue to read in 2 Samuel, time goes on and David is fighting and his men are fighting and he's successful on every side. At the beginning of this episode, in my introduction, I talked about what do we do when we are now living in the promise? What do we do? How do we steward well what God has purposed, what God has anointed? And in this second half of David's life, we learn how important it is to be responsible with what God has promised. So in around chapter 11, this is where David's stewardship, his responsibility, is tested. And not from God, just himself. Being a human, being a person, The Bible says that it's like the springtime, and this is typically a time where kings go out to war, but David was like, no, I'm tired of fighting, and he sent some other people out. So he's taking a walk, enjoying his palace, okay? Enjoying the crib. He tired of fighting. And he's on the roof, and as he looks over the city, he sees a woman whose name is Bathsheba. And Bathsheba is minding her business in her own self house, taking a bath. And David sees her and summons her to the palace. And he communes with her. And then she goes back home. Now, I just want to pause. Because we love David. And we're probably thinking, come on, D. We've come so far, David. What's happening? Why can't you just rest in the promises of God? But this is why I love David so much. Not because he's doing things that he shouldn't, but because he's human. He's just a person. He's just like us. He has emotions and feelings and temptations and makes mistakes just like us. Being obedient and trusting God does not mean that you're going to be perfect. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to make mistakes. So David finds out that Bathsheba is married to a soldier in his army, a fine soldier, a great soldier, a person that has been loyal to him. And then he also gets the news that, well, Bathsheba is pregnant. So David is now trying to cover his mistakes. He summons Uriah and he says, Uriah, you work so hard. You're doing a great job fighting all these battles. Go home to your wife, wink, wink. Be with her. Spend time with her. Commune with her. And the next day he sees Uriah and he's like, yo, what's up? You didn't go home? And Uriah, being a loyal stand-up guy that he is like, no, sir. I was here guarding the Ark of the Covenant, guarding the gates, doing my job. It didn't seem right for me to go home to my wife. So David has to come up with another plan because word cannot get out. And so he sends one of his captains of his guard to put Uriah on the front line. I know. Why, David? Why? Puts him on the front line, and Uriah is killed in battle, and Bathsheba moves into the palace and becomes one of David's wives. Let's all just take a breath. Not because we expect David to be perfect, right? But I mean, it's a little disappointing, but I think there's a lesson here because we have to steward well. And David has been through a pretty rough patch in his life, and now he is in an easeful part, He is living and answered prayers. There it is. He's living and answered prayers. And he's comfortable. And he sees something that he wants. And then he covers his tracks by continuing to be dishonest. And so unfortunately, there are always going to be consequences for our choices, whether you believe in God or not. And so unfortunately, that baby dies. But remember God's promise. David's mistakes did not cancel out the promise that God said he would have and bless his lineage and his legacy, and he would have a dynasty. And so David went to the Lord and he repented and he asked for forgiveness for the choice that he made. And God forgave him. It didn't erase the consequence, but God forgave him. But Nathan came back to David and said, hey, because of your choice, your lineage, there's going to be some beef. It's not going to be smooth sailing. Yes, God has still promised you a dynasty. Yes, your name will live on. Yes, your offspring will build my temple. And also, some of your kids, some of the folks in your lineage, they gonna give you a headache. They gonna give you some problems. It's gonna be some unrest. But God has forgiven you. And so Bathsheba becomes pregnant again, and she has a son, and they name him Solomon. And if you like history like me, then you might know that Solomon was by far one of the most intelligent, richest, prominent kings in the world. And he absolutely did build God's temple, just as God had destined. That's not all Solomon did. Solomon is considered one of the most wisest people to have ever lived. He wrote all of the Proverbs. He wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, and he wrote the Songs of Solomon. David wrote over 73 Psalms. Do you want to know what the biggest, I think, accomplishment, the most important part of David's legacy, the most important fact, I think the most important thing that stands out to me, besides David's heart and David's character, is that Jesus is in the lineage of David. That's right. The promise that God gave to David of a kingdom and a dynasty that will live forever wasn't just speaking about Solomon. But if you continue to follow the lineage of David, it will lead you to Jesus. And I think that that's amazing. That our obedience, that our trust, walking in purpose, will leave a life-lasting legacy for generations to come. And the tricky thing about legacy is that legacy can be either good or it can be bad. David left a legacy of being a warrior and putting God first. But he also left a legacy of some moral failures that he passed on to his children as well. And I'm not saying that to bash him. It's just the purpose of Kingdom Conversations is for us to hold a place for our humanity and for our spiritualness. And David holds such a close place to my heart because I think he exemplifies both wholeheartedly. He loved God. His heart was for God. And he was just a person trying to figure out as he went, making mistakes, but he repented and was godly sorrowful when he did not please God. And so I want to encourage you today and to remind you that purpose is not an abstract thing. As I've done these episodes, I've come to the realization that it's not this abstract thing in the sky, that purpose really is a journey. And it requires patience, it requires trust, it requires resilience, and it's going to be peaks and valleys. But the whole purpose is for us to grow, and I think to become closer to Christ so that we can learn more about who he is. At least that's what I think. There is no end. As long as you have breath in your body, you will be on the journey of fulfilling God's purpose for you. And different seasons of purpose will look different. But in all of them, even when we make mistakes, even when we're trying our best to steward them well, that if we do mess up, that Jesus loves us so much and he will forgive us and we can start anew. And we can have hope that even though that there will be consequences for the choices that we made, that God is not doing it to be mean or to punish us, but that we learn. Do you know that it is actual science? We all have synapses in our brain, and studies show that when you make a mistake, that new synapses grow. God is not asking for our perfection. God is asking for us to steward the gifts and the season and the jobs and the people that he has placed in our lives. And he is holding space for us to make mistakes when we do. Because I think that's also part of purpose, the learning from the mistakes that we make and to have a repentive spirit and a repentive heart if we slip up. When we talk about purpose, we can't stop at the promise. David reminds us that arrival is only the beginning. Stewardship matters once the throne is occupied. Repentance matters when the weight of responsibility sets in. Legacy is shaped not just by what we build, but by how we respond when we fall short. Solomon shows us that inheriting blessing still requires wisdom and restraint. Success doesn't cancel accountability. Abundance doesn't remove the need for faithfulness. And even with flawed stewardship and unfinished work, God remains faithful. The promise carries on. The lineage holds. And through David's line comes Jesus, not just a king or a builder, but the fulfillment of what every throne and temple was pointing toward. Purpose doesn't end with arrival. Legacy is formed in stewardship, and God's faithfulness outlasts us all. Thank you for sitting with this one. I really hope you enjoyed this Purpose series. Until next time, this is Kingdom Conversations. Thank you for listening to Kingdom Conversations. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Kingdom Convo Podcast. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast, Spotify, Apple Music, or YouTube. And make sure you subscribe so that you can get updates for new episodes every Tuesday.